The flood came to Marrow Bend like the Gulf had forgotten where the shore ended. Sawyer Voss, an ex-Navy SEAL haunted by thunder, was only trying to keep the pumps alive. Then he saw a young German shepherd clinging to a broken board in the rushing water. He swam for the dog, not knowing the name Keel had already been erased from official records. By morning, the rescue became a question no one wanted asked. How could a living K9 be listed as dead 3 months before the storm? Listen to the end and tell us where you're watching from. Your like and subscribe will help us reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. Marrow Bend, Louisiana, sat so low against the Gulf that old men joked the town had been built on a dare between God and the water. The houses stood on stilts, their wooden legs sunk deep into mud that smelled of salt, shrimp shells, engine oil, and rain. Boats were tied beside porches the way horses might have been tied in another century. Wind chimes hung from roof beams, oyster shells lined garden paths, and every family kept at least one emergency radio, 2 flashlights, and an opinion about which storms had been worse than the newspapers claimed. Sawyer Voss kept all those things too, except the opinions. At 51, he lived alone in a small raised house near the old pump dock, where the bayou widened into gray water and then disappeared into marsh grass. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and built like a man who had once learned to carry weight without asking who had packed it. His hair was cut in a neat undercut, dark brown with silver at the temples, and his face was clean-shaven, angular, and weathered by sun, salt air, and silence. People in Marrow Bend knew him as the man to call when a pump choked, when a drainage line coughed mud, when a generator refused to wake during a storm. He fixed what could be fixed. He charged fair. He did not linger afterward for coffee, unless someone insisted twice, and even then he drank it standing near the door. They knew he had been a Navy SEAL. They knew he had come home years ago after something overseas had gone wrong. They knew, in the careful way small towns knew things without saying them straight, that thunder sometimes carried him away. Sawyer did not correct them. He did not explain the mission in the Middle East, or the 2 men who had not walked back with him, or the way a clean sky could still feel unsafe if a sound struck the wrong door in his mind. He had learned that grief made people uncomfortable when it refused to dress politely. So he worked. He rebuilt pumps. He replaced belts. He cleared weeds from intake screens and crawled under houses where snakes had more confidence than plumbers. He kept his old aluminum boat tied behind the shed, his toolbox in the bed of a battered pickup, and a black and green paracord bracelet around his left wrist. On bad nights, he held that bracelet until his knuckles paled. On good nights, he did not notice he was holding it. The morning Hurricane Marrow Bend made landfall, the sky turned the color of wet pewter. Rain came sideways across Marrow Bend, slapping windows and flattening the marsh grass until the whole town seemed to bow beneath it. The wind pressed its shoulder against every wall. Power lines hummed. The bayou rose with a dark, patient hunger. By noon, the emergency sirens had already sounded twice. By 3, Cypress Row was underwater. Cypress Row was the new development on the north side, a neat row of pale houses built for people who liked bay views but did not yet understand the bay had a personality. The levee near it had been reinforced before storm season, or so the reports had said. Fresh gravel, new signs, contractors with clean trucks, men in hard hats pointing at clipboards as if paper could hold back the Gulf. But when Marrow Bend came, that levee failed too fast. It did not merely overflow, it opened. Water poured through the break and rushed down the streets of Cypress Row, carrying porch chairs, garbage bins, broken lattice, flower pots, and a spinning license plate that flashed like a fish belly in the gray light. One mailbox drifted past Sawyer's boat with its little red flag still raised, as if waiting for a letter from the end of the world. Sawyer had not been ordered out. No one had called him a hero. He had taken the boat because 2 portable pumps were still running near the lower road, and if they failed, the shelter on Baptist Hill might lose its dry approach. That was reason enough. A pump was a promise. So long as it coughed and rattled and spat water away from a door, someone had a chance. He wore a dark rain jacket over a fitted olive work shirt, waterproof cargo pants, gloves, and old black tactical boots, scarred by years of mud and salt. Rain streamed off the brim of his hood. His boat bucked under him as he guided it between half-submerged fences and the tops of drowned shrubs. The engine stuttered once. "Don't start preaching now," Sawyer muttered. The motor, perhaps offended, kept running. He checked the first pump near a flooded service road. The machine rattled, but held. The second had sucked in a coil of plastic garden edging. He leaned over, cut it free, cleared the intake, and gave the casing 2 firm taps with a wrench. The pump roared back to life. "Good girl," he said, though the pump was older than most marriages in town and twice as loud. Then thunder rolled over Marrow Bend. It came heavy and sudden, not a crack, but a deep concussive boom that seemed to rise from under the water. Sawyer froze with one hand on the wrench. For a heartbeat, rain vanished. The pump's engine became a faraway vehicle. The gray Louisiana street stretched and broke apart into tan dust and white glare. A radio voice snapped in his memory. A name shouted once, then another. His left hand closed around the paracord bracelet. The boat bumped against a porch railing, and the present returned in pieces. Rain on his hood, diesel in the air, cold water against the hull, the pump shaking under his palm. Sawyer breathed once, twice. "Here," he whispered to himself, "Marrow Bend, Pump Road, storm water, not there." It was an old ritual, and like most old rituals, it worked only when it wanted to. He turned the boat back toward the main channel. The wind shoved at him. A branch scraped the side with a long wooden groan. Somewhere to the east, a transformer popped, throwing a brief blue flash behind the wall of rain. That was when he heard it. Not a bark, not at first. A thin, scraping sound. Sawyer cut the motor. The world became louder without it. Rain hammered the water. Wind dragged itself through broken tree limbs. A loose power line creaked against a leaning pole. Something metallic knocked again and again under a flooded porch. Then the sound came once more. Scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. Sawyer turned slowly, scanning the current. Nothing but debris rolled past. A cooler, a shutter, a child's plastic chair with no child anywhere near it, thank God. The water was brown and fast, twisting around submerged obstacles with ugly little whirlpools. Then he saw the board, a wide piece of splintered plywood, spun near the center of the flooded street, caught in a fierce current that pulled toward the broken drainage canal. Clinging to it was a young German shepherd. For 1 second, Sawyer's mind refused the shape. The animal looked too small against the flood, too thin beneath the soaked black and gold fur. Not a tiny puppy? No. The legs were too long, the head too noble, the shoulders beginning to form the strength of a working dog. But the body was underfed, unfinished, trembling. 18 months maybe, 22 at most. Its front paws hooked into the wood, its hind legs dragged in the water. Its amber-brown eyes locked onto Sawyer with a terror so focused it looked almost human. The dog made a sound again. Not a bark. A plea? Sawyer looked downstream. A fallen tree had wedged against 2 porch posts, making a jagged trap of branches and wire. If the board hit it wrong, the dog would be pulled under or pinned. Beyond that, the water dropped toward the canal mouth, where the current folded in on itself like a dark hand closing. Sawyer reached for the rescue rope coiled beside the seat. Thunder cracked overhead. This time it was sharp. The sky split white. Sawyer's body went still. For a few seconds, the flooded street was gone. The air tasted of dust and hot metal. Rain became grit striking his face. The dog's eyes became a flare in the distance. His own breath sounded trapped inside a helmet he was no longer wearing. The rope slipped from his hand. Then the dog whined, small, raw, alive. The sound cut through the memory, not like a trumpet, not like some grand command from heaven, but like a paw tapping at a locked door. Sawyer blinked. Louisiana came back hard and cold. The dog was still there. The board was closer to the tree. "No," Sawyer said. It was not a dramatic word. It did not belong in a movie trailer. It was the kind of word a man said when there was no time left to be afraid of himself. He killed the engine, tied one end of the rope around the boat's stern cleat, and looped the other around his waist with hands that remembered knots better than they remembered peace. He checked the current, the floating debris, the angle of the board. A porch chair spun past. A branch followed. Sawyer waited one breath, then went over the side. The flood swallowed him up to the shoulders. Cold struck first, then force. The current grabbed his legs and tried to fold him downstream. He kicked hard, using the rope not as safety alone, but as argument. Rain needled his face. Something bumped his thigh. He ignored it and drove forward, one arm cutting water, the other reaching. The German shepherd saw him coming and panicked. The dog tried to climb higher onto the board, but its paws slipped. The board tipped. For a terrible second, Sawyer saw the animal's head dip low, ears flattened, mouth open, but no sound strong enough to rise above the flood. "Hold on," Sawyer grunted, though the dog could not understand the words. Or maybe it understood the shape of a voice that meant stay. Sawyer reached the board just as it struck a half-submerged fence. The impact jolted the dog loose. Sawyer lunged, caught the wet scruff and harnessless shoulders, and pulled the animal against his chest. The dog fought him for one wild moment, not aggression, survival. Claws scraped his rain jacket. A paw hit his chin. The body in his arms was all bone, muscle, cold water, and panic. "Easy," Sawyer said through clenched teeth. "Easy, sailor." The word came from nowhere. Sailor. The dog shuddered against him. Sawyer shifted, turning his own body downstream so the current hit his back instead of the dog's face. He tightened one arm under the shepherd's chest and used the other to pull along the rope. The boat looked impossibly far away. A branch scraped past his shoulder. The rope burned against his jacket. The dog's claws dug into him. Then, as if some old lesson woke inside its body, it stopped thrashing. Its front legs hooked over Sawyer's right shoulder, its head pressed beside his neck. It held on. Sawyer felt the change. Not trust, not yet. But a decision. That was enough. He pulled. The current dragged. The rope held. Inch by inch he fought back toward the boat, the dog clinging to him like a frightened shadow given weight. By the time Sawyer reached the hull, his arms shook from cold and effort. He shoved the dog upward first, rolling it over the side into the boat's shallow bottom. Then he hauled himself in after it, landing hard on one knee. For a while both of them lay still. Rain filled the boat around them. The dog coughed, then lifted its head. Mud streaked its muzzle. Its left ear sagged lower than the right. Along its chest, under the dirty fur, Sawyer noticed a pale mark, a small hook-shaped patch of gold against darker hair. An anchor, almost. The dog stared at him. Sawyer stared back. "Well," he said hoarsely, "you picked a poor day for swimming lessons." The dog did not laugh, which Sawyer considered ungrateful, but understandable. A gust of wind shoved the boat sideways. The current had carried them offline, pushing them toward a cluster of fallen trees where an old flat-bottomed skiff sat jammed between trunks and porch beams. Sawyer got the motor started with a cough and a curse, but the prop caught weeds almost immediately. He had just enough control to steer into the tangled shelter of the trees before the engine died again. The aluminum boat struck the trapped skiff with a hollow thud. There, wedged among branches, the water moved slower. Sawyer grabbed his emergency tarp and dragged the shepherd closer. The dog's body trembled violently now, shock settling in after the fight. Its fur was black along the back and saddle, gold along the legs and face, though all of it was painted in mud. The ribs showed too clearly under the wet coat. The eyes remained bright, frightened, and aware. "You need a name," Sawyer said, because talking was easier than admitting his hands had begun to shake too. The dog blinked. Sawyer looked at the wrecked skiff, at the broken boards, at the way the animal had stayed afloat on one stubborn piece of wood. "Keel," he said at last. "That'll do until you tell me different." The shepherd lowered its head onto the tarp. Sawyer wrapped the dark rain jacket around the dog's body, leaving himself in the soaked olive shirt beneath. His own teeth clicked once before he clenched his jaw. He glanced toward the nearest raised house, an old place abandoned since the last big storm, its porch still above water by some mercy of elevation and stubborn construction. He lifted Keel carefully. The dog made one weak protest, then rested its chin on Sawyer's shoulder, as if too tired to argue with the arrangement. Getting from the boat to the porch took longer than it should have. Sawyer moved through waist-deep water, testing each step before trusting it. Twice thunder rolled, and twice he felt the edge of that other place open inside him. Each time, Keel's breath brushed warm and ragged against his neck. Not there, Sawyer told himself. Here. Rain, wood, dog, porch, here. Inside the abandoned stilt house, the air smelled of old cedar, mildew and dust. The windows rattled in their frames. A faded couch sat against one wall. A calendar from 3 years ago still hung in the kitchen, showing a red fishing boat under a sunset too bright to belong to this day. Sawyer set Keel on the couch and stripped off his wet outer layers. He found an old blanket in a closet, shook out the dust, and wrapped the dog in it. Then he sat on the floor beside him, back against the couch, one hand resting lightly near Keel's paws. He did not sleep. Outside, Marrow Bend roared over Marrow Bend like an ancient beast denied its meal. Rain struck the roof. Water shoved against the house posts. Somewhere, boards cracked. Somewhere else, a loose shutter banged with the rhythm of a distant alarm. Sawyer's left hand found the paracord bracelet. He held it. Then Keel, still shivering under the blanket, shifted just enough to place his muddy muzzle over Sawyer's wrist. Not hard, not trained, not magic, just weight. Warmth. A living thing choosing contact in a ruined room while the world outside tried to become water. Sawyer looked down at the young shepherd. The dog's eyes were half closed, but not empty. They held fear, exhaustion, and something else Sawyer recognized only because he had carried it for years. The stubborn refusal to disappear. He let his fingers relax around the bracelet. "All right, Keel," he whispered. "We'll stay afloat till morning." The dog exhaled a thin, shaky breath. In that abandoned house above the flood, beneath a roof that complained but held, a man haunted by thunder and a dog erased before his time sat together through the storm. Neither saved the other completely that night, but neither was alone when the water rose. By morning, Marrow Bend smelled like wet wood, weak coffee, and people pretending not to be afraid. The storm had not left. It had only changed its posture. The wind no longer struck the town with both fists, but rain still combed the streets in silver sheets, and the water kept moving where streets used to be. The old Baptist church on the hill had become the closest thing to a fortress. Its white steeple leaned a little after 20 years of storms, but the building had stood through worse, and in Marrow Bend, survival counted for beauty. Beside the church sat the community hall, a low brick building with a metal roof and a basketball hoop crooked over the parking lot. That morning it held half the town's fear. People crowded inside with damp blankets, plastic bags of medicine, phone chargers, canned food, and the tired faces of those who had spent the night listening to water climb. Elderly fishermen sat shoulder to shoulder with gas station clerks. A woman who owned the seafood diner kept trying to organize coffee as if caffeine could restore civilization. Someone's old hound slept under a folding table. A parrot in a travel cage occasionally shouted, "Bad idea," which, given the situation, felt less like mimicry and more like prophecy. Sawyer Voss stood just inside the doorway, rainwater dripping from his sleeves. Keel stayed pressed against his left leg. The young German shepherd had survived the night, though survived was a thin word for it. His black and gold coat was still rough with dried mud, his ribs showed under damp fur, and one ear sat lower than the other, as if exhaustion had pulled it down. Sawyer had wrapped him in an old blanket during the night, then carried him partway through the flooded road, before Keel insisted on walking. That insistence had not been graceful. He had wobbled twice, stepped on Sawyer's boot once, and nearly sat down in a puddle, with the weary dignity of a prince whose kingdom had become soup. But he walked. Now, in the community hall, Keel did not hide behind Sawyer. He did not bark at strangers. He did not bare his teeth. He simply watched. When a man hurried too close carrying a crate of bottled water, Keel shifted half a step forward, placing his thin body between the man and Sawyer's knee. When two volunteers rushed past with a cot, Keel turned his shoulders, tracking them with quiet focus. When a childless elderly couple reached down to pet him without warning, he retreated just enough to avoid the hands, then returned to Sawyer's side. Sawyer noticed. He had known scared dogs. Some snapped at air, some curled into themselves, some ran until they were lost twice over. Keel did none of those things. He behaved like a young recruit who had forgotten the name of his unit but remembered where to stand in a formation. "You got yourself a shadow there, Voss." Sawyer turned. Marlin Bix, who ran the bait shop near the South Docks, stood beside a stack of bottled water. He was a thin man with a beard like wet moss and a cap that read, "Live bait, dead honest." "Found him in the water," Sawyer said. Marlin looked down at Keel. "Looks like the water found him first." Keel blinked, then leaned slightly into Sawyer's leg. "He needs a vet," Sawyer said. "Half the town needs something," Marlin muttered, but he pointed toward the back of the hall. "Nadine's here, came in with a truck full of carriers and more attitude than medical supplies." That was how most people described Dr. Nadine Mercer when they liked her. Sawyer guided Keel through the crowded room. He moved slowly, not because he was weak, but because the hall was too full of noise. Plastic crinkled, radios hissed, boots squeaked on wet tile. A generator coughed outside the back door. Every sound had edges. Sawyer kept his left hand relaxed by his side, not closed around the paracord bracelet. Not yet. Keel kept pace with him. Near the far wall, someone had turned a row of folding tables into a makeshift animal station. There were towels, bowls, bottles of antiseptic, a few crates, a chipped scale, and a handwritten sign that said, "Pet Check-In," though the word pet had been crossed out and replaced with animals, because Nadine Mercer believed goats, cats, dogs, parrots, and whatever lived in Earl Pritchard's shed deserved equal bureaucratic respect. Dr. Nadine Mercer was bent over a mud-splattered tabby cat when Sawyer approached. She was in her mid-50s, broad in the shoulders, with chin-length gray-brown hair pinned badly behind one ear. Her blue-green scrub top was hidden under a rain jacket the color of old teal paint. Reading glasses hung from a cord around her neck, and 3 pens stuck out of her chest pocket like tiny flags of surrender. "Tell Mrs. Babineau," Nadine said to a volunteer without looking up, "that her cat is not traumatized. Her cat is furious. There is a medical difference." The volunteer nodded as if receiving sacred instruction. Then Nadine looked at Sawyer. Her gaze dropped to Keel. The dryness left her face for half a second. "Well," she said softly, "you had a rough night, didn't you?" Sawyer almost answered before realizing she was speaking to the dog. Keel lowered his head, but did not back away. "Found him in Cypress Row floodwater," Sawyer said. "Cold, weak, took in water, but he's breathing steady now." Nadine's eyes flicked up to him, sharper than her voice. "You pulled him out?" "Board drifted near the canal." "That wasn't what I asked." Sawyer said nothing. Nadine made a small sound through her nose, not quite approval, not quite annoyance. "Of course you did. Sit him here." Keel hesitated at the metal table. The moment Sawyer touched his shoulder, the dog went still. Not relaxed, but cooperative. Nadine noticed that too. Her hand slowed. She did not grab him. She let him smell her fingers first. "Good manners for a stray," she murmured. Keel's tail gave one uncertain twitch. "Not sure he's a stray," Sawyer said. "No collar?" "Only mud." "No tag?" "No." "Microchip?" "Haven't checked." Nadine ran her hands along Keel's legs, ribs, neck, and shoulders, with the careful speed of someone who had done this all her life. Her mouth tightened at the ribs, tightened again at the small scar along the edge of his left ear. Then her fingers paused at his front elbows. She looked closer. Sawyer watched her expression change. "What?" he asked. Nadine did not answer immediately. She pressed gently along Keel's forelegs, then his chest, then the outer shoulder where the fur was darker and still damp. "These calluses," she said. "He was in the water all night." "These aren't from last night." She lifted one of Keel's front paws. The dog allowed it, though his eyes moved to Sawyer. Nadine ran her thumb over the thickened skin near the joint. "See this? Not street wear, not porch wear. This is repeated pressure, low crawl, obstacle work. Maybe concrete tunnels, maybe training tubes." Sawyer felt something inside him become very still. "Training?" "I've treated enough working dogs to know the difference between wandering and drilling." Nadine glanced at Keel's narrow chest, his long legs, the unfinished strength in him. "He's young, but somebody put time into him." Keel suddenly shifted. A volunteer had dropped a metal bowl behind them. It hit the tile with a bright, ringing clang. Sawyer's breath stopped. Not fully, not visibly to most people. But enough. His hand moved toward the bracelet. Keel turned first toward the sound, then immediately back to Sawyer. He stepped off the mat, pressed his shoulder against Sawyer's shin, and held there. No bark, no drama, just contact. Nadine saw that too. Her eyes softened, though her voice stayed practical. "Interesting?" Sawyer looked down at the dog. "He's just nervous?" "Maybe." Nadine reached for a towel. "Or maybe he knows what a person looks like right before they leave the room without moving." Sawyer did not answer. There were people who said kind things and somehow made them feel like pity. Nadine was not one of them. She spoke like a woman naming a weather. Plain, unavoidable, without decoration. Keel leaned harder into Sawyer's leg. For the first time since the rescue, Sawyer wondered whether the dog had been clinging to him only because he was scared, or whether, in some strange way, Keel had also been keeping count of him. Nadine was about to reach for the scanner when a new voice slipped through the noise of the hall. "Dr. Mercer, Mr. Voss." It was not loud. That made it worse. The man approaching them wore a clean navy rain jacket with the Cypress Row logo stitched over the chest. Clean was the first thing Sawyer noticed. In a room full of mud, damp hair, wet cuffs, and exhausted faces, the man looked as if the storm had politely stepped aside for him. His light brown hair was combed neatly, his boots had only a ceremonial amount of dirt, and he carried a black waterproof clipboard against his ribs. Reese Calloway. Sawyer had seen him twice before, both times at a distance, once speaking to residents near Cypress Row's leasing office, once standing beside contractors before the storm season, nodding at things he likely did not understand but intended to manage. Reese smiled with only the lower half of his face. "I'm glad I caught you," he said. Nadine picked up the scanner anyway. "That makes one of us." Reese's smile did not move. We're trying to keep the shelter organized. After a flood event, unverified animals have to be logged and transferred." "Logged, yes," Nadine said. "Transferred, maybe. Treated, definitely." Reese turned to Sawyer, softening his voice further. "Mr. Voss, I understand you recovered this animal during the night." "This animal has a name," Sawyer said. A small pause. "Does he?" Reese asked. Sawyer felt Nadine glance at him, felt Keel's body against his leg. "Keel," he said. Reese wrote something on the clipboard. The pen made a neat little scratch. "Keel. All right. The problem is that Keel has no visible rabies tag, no owner confirmation, and no current vaccination proof. Under emergency shelter guidance, he needs to be moved to the parish quarantine point until status can be verified." "Parish Quarantine Point is a storage garage behind animal control," Nadine said. "Half the kennels flood in a hard rain." Reese tilted his head, as if saddened by her tone. "We're doing the best we can under difficult conditions." "That sentence has covered more sins than Spanish moss," Nadine said. A few people nearby looked over. Reese noticed. Sawyer watched him notice. The man did not stiffen. He adjusted. "I'm not here to argue," Reese said. "I'm here to reduce risk. People are frightened. We have elderly residents in this building. We have displaced families. We cannot have an unverified large dog moving freely through the shelter." Keel had not moved freely anywhere. He stood with his shoulder touching Sawyer's leg, thin as a promise and twice as tired. Sawyer said, "He stays with me until she checks him." "That may not be your decision." The room seemed to shrink around the words. Sawyer looked at Reese then, really looked, clean jacket, calm hands, clipboard held like a shield, soft voice, soft smile, soft knife. Nadine placed one hand lightly on Keel's back. "He is under veterinary assessment. Doctor with respect." "Oh, good," Nadine said. "A respectful sentence. Those always end well." Reese's eyes cooled. "With respect, your assessment does not override emergency protocol. And your protocol does not override medical necessity." Sawyer could feel people watching now. That was the part he hated. Not danger. Watching. Whispering. The sudden weight of other people deciding what kind of man he was. Reese lowered his voice, but not enough. "Mr. Voss, I'm also aware that last night was stressful. For everyone. Given your history, it may be better to let trained county personnel handle this situation." The generator outside coughed. Rain struck the roof. Somewhere above the hall, thunder rolled. It was not as loud as the crack over the flood, but the metal roof gathered it and sent it down through the beams. Sawyer's vision narrowed. The room blurred at the edges. For half a breath, folding tables became equipment cases. The generator became a vehicle. The clipboard became something else entirely. His fingers found the paracord bracelet. Then Keel moved. The young shepherd stepped directly in front of him and pressed his head into Sawyer's knee. Hard, deliberate. His thin body trembled, but he stayed there, blocking the space between Sawyer and Reese. Sawyer looked down. Keel looked up, not begging, not afraid only. Present. The room returned by degrees. Nadine's teal jacket, Reese's silver pen, the smell of coffee, the parrot muttering "bad idea" from somewhere behind them. Sawyer let out the breath he had been holding. Nadine's voice cut through the silence. "That dog is not going anywhere." Reese turned to her. "You don't have authority to make that call." "No," she said, "but I have authority to say he is dehydrated, underweight, shock-stressed, and in need of immediate care. Move him now and you risk worsening his condition. If you want to explain that on an incident form, spell my name right." Reese's jaw shifted once. A man with a clean jacket could still get dirty if enough people watched him refuse mercy. Finally, Reese closed the clipboard. "Fine," he said. "Temporary medical hold. I'll need documentation. You'll get it when I write it." "I'll be back." "I was afraid of that." Reese looked at Sawyer one last time. The smile returned, thin as fishing line. "Take care of yourself, mister." "Voss," he said, "storms can make judgment difficult." Then he walked away, leaving no mud behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the parrot shouted, "Bad idea!" A ripple of tired laughter moved through the hall. It did not erase the tension, but it loosened its grip. Nadine exhaled. "I hate that bird less than I expected." Sawyer crouched beside Keel and placed a hand on the dog's damp neck. "You all right?" Keel leaned into him. Nadine watched the two of them, and for once her dry expression faded into something almost gentle. "Let's get him somewhere quieter," she said. The temporary clinic had been set up in the church's rear annex, where Sunday school rooms had become storage, triage, and sleeping space for volunteers. Nadine led them through a side hallway that smelled of old hymnals, bleach wipes, and rain-soaked plywood. The room she used had a cracked linoleum floor, a folding exam table, and a small battery pack running a laptop and scanner. Keel entered cautiously. At the sight of a wire crate in the corner, he stopped. His whole body tightened. Not dramatic, not wild, just a sudden stillness so complete it felt like the air had been pulled from him. Sawyer saw it. Nadine saw it too. "No crate," she said quietly, and pushed it into the hallway. Keel breathed again. Sawyer filed that away with the calluses, the guarding, the way Keel had pressed into his knee at the exact moment thunder opened the old door in his mind. Nadine gave Keel fluids, cleaned a few minor scrapes, and checked his temperature. The dog tolerated everything, though his eyes kept returning to Sawyer. When Nadine finally lifted the microchip scanner, she did it slowly. "Let's see who you were before the flood," she said. She passed the scanner along Keel's neck. Nothing. Again across the shoulders. Nothing. Then lower, near the left side of the chest. The scanner beeped. A single bright sound in the small room. Nadine entered the number into the laptop. The battery pack hummed. Rain ticked against the window. Sawyer stood with one hand resting on Keel's back, feeling each breath rise under his palm. The connection lagged once. Then the record opened. Nadine leaned closer. Her face changed first. Sawyer knew enough about bad news to recognize the shape of it before the words arrived. "What is it?" he asked. Nadine did not answer right away. She turned the laptop slightly so he could see. The record was plain. Official. Cold. Harbor's Keel Bayline, response and recovery. K-9 search and rescue trainee status. Deceased in training accident date. Recorded 3 months prior. Sawyer stared at the screen. Keel stood alive beneath his hand, thin and muddy, and breathing in the little room behind the church. Nadine removed her glasses, wiped them once on her scrub top, then put them back on as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. They did not. "Well," she said, her dry voice gone quiet. "That's a problem." Sawyer looked from the screen to Keel. The dog's amber eyes lifted to him, tired but present, as if waiting for a command no one had the right to give any more. Outside, the community hall rumbled with voices and rain and the weary machinery of survival. Inside, the room seemed very small. Sawyer's hand settled more firmly on Keel's back. "He's not deceased," he said. "No," Nadine replied. "He is most certainly not." The laptop glow reflected in Sawyer's eyes. 3 months dead on paper. 1 night alive in his arms. A name erased by someone's record and carried back by a flood that had no patience for lies. Keel gave one low, exhausted breath. Sawyer bent closer, his voice barely above the rain. "Then we start there." Dr. Nadine Mercer made 3 calls before noon, and each one left the room colder. The first call went to the state microchip registry. The second went to a regional animal records office. The third went to a woman in Baton Rouge who sounded as if she had been answering disaster-related phone calls since the dawn of mankind and had lost patience somewhere around Hurricane number 12. Nadine kept the phone tucked between her shoulder and ear while she wrote notes on a clipboard. Her glasses had slid halfway down her nose. A paper cup of coffee sat beside the laptop, untouched and already surrendered to room temperature. Sawyer stood near the rear door of the church annex, arms folded, watching rain crawl down the window glass. Keel lay under the folding exam table. Not in a crate. Never in a crate. Nadine had made that decision without discussion after seeing how the young shepherd had gone rigid at the sight of wire bars. Now Keel had chosen the dim space beneath the table, his long legs folded awkwardly beneath him, his black and gold coat still drying in uneven patches. His muzzle rested on Sawyer's boot. Every few minutes, Sawyer shifted slightly. Every time, Keel opened one amber eye to make sure he was still there. "No," Nadine said into the phone, her voice flat enough to iron shirts. "I understand what the status says. I'm asking who entered it." A pause. "No veterinarian listed?" Another pause. "No cremation certificate?" Her pen stopped moving. "No final incident report either?" Sawyer looked over. Nadine's face had changed in the way the sky changed before lightning, not loud yet, but charged. "I see," she said. "And Bayline Response and Recovery is no longer active?" Keel's ear twitched at the name. Sawyer noticed. Nadine noticed Sawyer noticing. She finished the call with a thank you that sounded more like a warning, then set the phone down. "Well?" Sawyer asked. Nadine removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Your dog belonged to Bayline Response and Recovery, private search and rescue outfit, storm drills, missing person support, flood evacuation mapping, that sort of thing." "He's not my dog." Keel's eye opened again. Nadine glanced down. "You might want to tell him that gently." Sawyer looked away. Nadine continued. 3 months ago, Keel was marked deceased after a training accident. No veterinary sign-off, no exam record, no disposal record, no handler signature, just a status entry and a closed file. Sawyer stared at the rain. A living dog had become a deadline in a database. The neatness of it bothered him. The clean cruelty of paperwork always had. A storm could break a window. A man with access could erase a life without raising his voice. "Could be clerical error," he said. "It could be," Nadine said. "And I could wake up tomorrow with the knees of a 20-year-old ballerina. We live in hope." Keel shifted beneath the table, pressing his muzzle more firmly over Sawyer's boot. Sawyer felt it through the leather. He had spent years building a life out of narrow choices. Fix the pump, cash the check, avoid the parade, leave before the fireworks, don't ask questions that open doors. A dead dog breathing under a table was exactly the kind of door he did not want. Nadine leaned against the counter and lowered her voice. "I know that look." "What look?" "The one men get when they're deciding whether doing the right thing is about to ruin their week." "It's already ruined." "Then you're free?" Sawyer almost smiled. Almost. Before he could answer, the side door opened and a woman in a faded red-orange rescue jacket stepped in, carrying a radio, a thermos, and the expression of someone who had personally argued with the weather and found it rude. "Nadine," the woman said, "your volunteer at the hall told me you were hiding back here with a mystery dog and a tall storm cloud." Sawyer turned. The woman was in her early 60s, small and wiry, with short silver hair flattened by rain and eyes that missed very little. A battered handheld radio was clipped to her shoulder, wrapped in silver tape, with a red ribbon tied to its antenna. She looked at Sawyer once, at Keel twice, then at Nadine. "If this is the dog from the flood," she said, "I heard half the town telling it wrong already." "Marlene Tate," Nadine said. "Sawyer Voss. Keel. currently dead according to the state and annoyingly alive according to reality. Marlene looked down as Keel crawled halfway out from under the exam table. The dog did not rush her. He stood, thin and guarded, left ear tilted lower than the right. Marlene crouched slowly, knees cracking like old porch boards. "Bayline?" she asked softly. Keel froze. Sawyer felt the air change. Marlene did too. Her mouth tightened. "I'll be," she whispered. "You know Bayline?" Sawyer asked. "Worked radio coordination with them 3 storm seasons ago," Marlene said, still watching Keel. "Good people. Too organized for volunteers, too underpaid for professionals. They handled evacuation drills for some of the low neighborhoods. Dogs were better trained than half the parish council and kinder than the other half." Nadine handed her the clipboard. Marlene read the record and humor left her face. "They shut down fast," she said, "after a drill up near the north levee." Sawyer's gaze sharpened. "Cypress Row? Near enough?" Marlene stood, one hand on her knee. Calder and Rusk had just finished reinforcement work before storm season. Bayline ran a mock evacuation route for the development and the old pump access roads. A week later, their contracts started vanishing like crawfish at a church picnic. "Why?" Marlene gave him a look. "If I knew that, I'd be on television with better hair." Nadine tapped the clipboard. "Keel's file says dead 3 months ago." "Bayline lost their facility about then," Marlene said. "Not physically, legally. Lease trouble, contract trouble, insurance trouble, the usual swamp where truth goes to drown wearing a tie." Sawyer looked down at Keel. The young shepherd stood close enough for his shoulder to touch Sawyer's leg. Not leaning now. Listening. Sawyer had seen men do that. Bodies still, ears open, waiting for a command that might be bad news. "I'm not an investigator," Sawyer said. "No one here is," Marlene replied. "That's why we're probably doomed to do something useful." Nadine snorted. Sawyer should have walked away then. He knew it. A sane man would have let Nadine file a report, let the parish handle the dog, let the state untangle its own crooked string. He could go back to pumps and mud and silence. He could close the door before the room filled with ghosts. Then Keel lowered his head and nosed the paracord bracelet on Sawyer's wrist. Not hard, just once, a touch where memory lived. Sawyer looked down at the animal that had been declared gone by people who had not bothered to prove it. Some choices did not arrive as thunder. Some came quiet, with a wet nose against a scar no one else could see. "When the water drops," Sawyer said, "show me where Bayline was." Marlene's smile was small and grim. "Now there's a terrible idea with potential." By late afternoon, the rain thinned into a cold mist, and the water around the north access road had dropped enough for a truck with high tires and poor judgment. Marlene had both. Her old rescue pickup was the color of rust under red paint, with sandbags in the bed, and a dashboard crowded by maps, gum wrappers, and one plastic saint taped beside the radio. "St. Florian," Marlene said when she caught Sawyer looking. "Firefighters," he said. "Disaster work borrows whoever's available." Keel rode on the floorboard at Sawyer's feet, wrapped in a borrowed harness that did not fit quite right. He had refused the back seat, refused the truck bed, and finally settled where his shoulder could touch Sawyer's boot. They drove past drowned lawns, tilted mailboxes, and houses with water lines painted across their siding. Cypress Row looked pale and stunned beneath the gray sky. New homes stood in dirty water up to their porch steps. Luxury shutters hung crooked. A welcome sign floated face down in a ditch. Marlene turned down an industrial lane behind an old seafood packing building. Beyond it sat the Bayline warehouse. It was smaller than Sawyer expected. A long metal structure with a peeling blue stripe and half a sign still bolted above the office door. The words "Response and Recovery" remained. Bayline had been removed, leaving a cleaner ghost of letters behind. The padlock on the side entrance hung loose. "Storm did that?" Sawyer asked. Marlene lifted one eyebrow. "Storms get blamed for many things they didn't bother doing." Inside, the air smelled of mildew, rubber mats, old dog food, and something metallic beneath it all. Light entered through gaps in the siding. Water had washed mud across the floor in shallow waves, leaving lines of leaves, grit, and insulation. Keel stopped at the threshold. His body changed. Not panic, not exactly. Recognition. His head lowered. His left ear dipped. His breathing became quiet and quick. Sawyer did not pull the leash. He waited. Marlene stepped aside without making a joke. The warehouse held 2 rows of empty kennels, training cones stacked in a corner, a collapsed agility tunnel, a wall map warped by damp, and hooks where leashes had once hung. It felt like a school, after all the children had been told never to come back. Keel entered. Slowly. He walked along the kennels with a strange, careful dignity. At one gate he paused and sniffed the latch. At another he sat for 3 seconds, then stood again, as if his body remembered a routine his mind did not want. He did not bark. He did not pull. He moved like a young soldier through a barracks where every bunk had been stripped. Sawyer followed a few steps behind, feeling something in his chest grow tight. He had avoided places like this in his own life, rooms that remembered, lockers with names removed, beds made for men who would not return. The world loved clearing evidence of absence. It called it cleaning up. Keel stopped near the back corner. There, against the wall, stood a dented metal cabinet, its bottom rusted, one door bent inward. The dog lifted a paw, touched the cabinet once, then backed away so fast his hind legs nearly slipped. Sawyer crouched beside him. "Easy!" Keel trembled, eyes locked on the cabinet. Marlene came up behind them. "That storage unit used to hold training gear." Sawyer opened the cabinet. Nothing dramatic waited inside. No perfect folder stamped secret. No villain's confession tied with a ribbon. Just damp shelves, a broken flashlight, 2 cracked plastic bowls, a strip of faded webbing, and a bundle wrapped in a waterproof pouch that had been taped beneath the lowest shelf. Sawyer pulled it free. Inside was an old leash, frayed but intact, with embroidered letters nearly hidden by dirt. H. Keel took 1 step forward, sniffed it, and made a sound so low Sawyer felt it more than heard it. Marlene looked away for a moment. There was also a faded bayline patch and a small USB drive sealed in a damaged plastic sleeve. The sleeve had kept out some water, but not all. The metal connector was dull with corrosion. Marlene held it up. "Might be useless." "Might not," Sawyer said. They found an old office at the front with a battery lantern and a laptop Marlene had brought from the truck. It took 2 attempts, 1 soft curse, and Marlene threatening the machine with baptism before the USB opened. Most of the files were unreadable. A few thumbnails appeared, then froze. One video played without sound. Another had sound, but only black frames. The third stuttered into motion. Gray sky, levee grass, orange cones, men and women in bayline jackets moving through a drill route. A younger Keel, healthier but unmistakable, wore a training harness and worked beside a lean man with short brown hair. "That's Jonah Reed," Marlene said, "Keel's handler." On screen, Keel moved along the base of the north levee near a pump station. He stopped at a patch of soft ground, lowered his nose, circled once, then sat in a clear, trained alert. The camera shook. Jonah's voice came through broken wind and static. "Mark this section. He's catching something here." Another voice answered, too distorted to identify. The image skipped. Then Jonah again, closer to the camera, his face tense beneath a rain hood. "Not just the dog. Look at the seep line. Water's going the wrong way." The video ended. The office went silent except for the rain tapping the roof. Marlene replayed it twice. The second time, the image froze on Keel sitting beside the soft ground, young and focused, waiting to be understood. Sawyer leaned back. It was not enough. He knew that immediately. Not enough for charges, not enough for headlines, not enough to stand against a company like Calder and Rusk. A damaged video, a dead status microchip, and an old leash would be called confusion after a storm. Misfiled records, misinterpreted training footage. Coincidence, the soft bed where hard truths were often put to sleep. But it was enough to ask why, and why was dangerous. Marlene shut the laptop. "We need more." Sawyer looked at Keel. The dog lay beneath the desk now, muzzle on the old leash, eyes open. "No," Sawyer said. "He needed more 3 months ago." Marlene's face softened, then hardened again, because some women did not like being caught feeling too much. They left the warehouse as dusk gathered over the flooded road. Mist rose from the ditches. Somewhere in Cypress Row, a loose shutter knocked against a wall. Keel walked close to Sawyer, the old leash tucked in Sawyer's jacket pocket, like a relic from a life that had been stolen and badly hidden. Near Marlene's truck, an elderly man waited under a yellow-brown raincoat. He was tall once, maybe, but age had bent him toward the ground he understood too well. His hands were thin and veined, stained with oil that had outlived soap. A faded pump station cap sat low over pale blue eyes. "Marlene," he said. "Earl Pritchard," she replied. "Please tell me you're here because you brought pie." "Not today." "Then I'm already disappointed." Earl did not smile. His eyes were fixed on Keel. The dog stopped. Earl swallowed. "I heard him," the old man said. Sawyer stepped closer. "Heard who?" "That dog." Earl's voice trembled, not with fear, but with the strain of having doubted himself too long. "Before the storm, 2 nights before landfall. I was checking pressure at the auxiliary pump line near Calder and Rusk's material shed. Heard barking from inside the smaller storage building." Marlene went still. Earl looked at Keel as if seeing a ghost that had politely decided to breathe. "I told myself it was a stray," he said. "Told myself I was old and tired. But I knew it wasn't right. Sounded like a trained dog. Short barks. Same pattern." Sawyer felt the USB in his pocket, felt Keel beside him, alive and thin and silent. "What storage building?" Sawyer asked. Earl pointed north, past the darkening road, toward the place where the levee had opened and the flood had rushed through Cypress Row. "Near their supply line," he said. "Close enough that when the water came through, it would have taken anything inside." The rain began again, soft at first, like fingers on metal. Earl removed his cap, his white hair flattened beneath it. "If that's the same dog, Mr. Voss, then he didn't die in any training accident." Keel leaned against Sawyer's leg. The old man's voice dropped. He was waiting to be moved, and the flood got to him before they did. Sawyer looked toward the north levee, where the sky hung low and bruised over the broken land. The storm had carried many things into Marrow Bend: mud, wreckage, fear, ruin, and one erased name still breathing. By the second morning after Marrow Bend had learned the strange patience of disaster. People no longer expected the water to leave simply because they wanted it gone. They measured progress in porch steps reappearing, in the tops of mailboxes, in the sound of one more generator starting, in a neighbor saying the road was passable if a person drove slowly and did not value the bottom of their truck too highly. Sawyer Voss sat at the kitchen table of his raised house with a dead dog's file spread in front of him. Keel lay near the door, head between his paws, watching the room as if every corner might change its mind. He had eaten a little that morning. Not enough to satisfy Nadine Mercer, who had opinions about nutrition strong enough to qualify as weather events, but enough to make Sawyer breathe easier. On the table sat Earl Pritchard's waterproof notebook, the damaged USB, a printed copy of Keel's microchip record, and 3 photographs Marlene Tate had taken at the old Bayline warehouse. The papers looked small under the yellow kitchen light. Too small to push against a company with lawyers, inspectors, contractors, and logos on trucks. Marlene stood at the stove, making coffee in a dented percolator she had brought herself, because according to her, Sawyer's coffee tasted like boiled regret with a hint of wrench grease. Dr. Nadine Mercer sat with her reading glasses low on her nose, studying Keel's record for the 5th time. Her teal rain jacket hung over the back of a chair. Her hair was still damp from crossing the yard. Earl Pritchard occupied the chair nearest the window. The old pump technician had brought his notebook wrapped in 2 plastic grocery bags, as if it were a newborn or a small explosive. His faded cap sat on one knee. His thin hands rested on it, fingers stained faintly with oil that had outlived soap. Sawyer looked at the group and almost laughed. A retired SEAL who tried not to be known. A veterinarian who treated lies like bad infections. A radio volunteer with a mouth sharp enough to cut rope. An old man the town had spent years half ignoring. And a young German shepherd declared gone by a database, breathing by the door like a quiet accusation. If this was an army, it was the kind folk songs invented after the real armies failed to show up. Marlene poured coffee into mismatched mugs. "All right, somebody make this make sense before I start blaming ghosts, contractors, or parish council. I prefer to blame in that order." Earl opened his notebook. He did not speak immediately. His thumb moved over the cover, blue and water-worn, as if asking permission from the years inside it. "These are pressure readings from the auxiliary pump line near the North Levee," he said. "I kept them after retirement. Habit, mostly. My wife used to say I wrote down numbers the way other men wrote love letters." Marlene slid him a mug. "Romantic as a clogged drain, Earl." He almost smiled. Then he turned the pages. Sawyer leaned forward. The entries were neat, tight, written in pencil with dates, times, rainfall estimates, pump response, and short notes in the margin. Seepage near marker 14B. Pressure rise after light rain. Unusual. Reported. No response. Reinforcement crew on site. Access denied. Pump station door relocked from outside. Earl tapped the last note. That was before Marrow Bend, not during. Before. Nadine frowned. "Who did you report it to?" "Parish maintenance line first, then Cypress Row office, because it was their access road. Then a man from Calder and Rusk called me back and said the issue had been resolved." "Was it?" Sawyer asked. Earl looked out the window toward the gray, wet town. "If it was, we wouldn't be sitting here." Marlene connected the old laptop to the battery pack on Sawyer's counter. The USB took time to open, and the machine made a clicking sound that seemed personally offended by its assignment. Marlene patted it once. "Don't embarrass me in front of company." The video stuttered to life again. The Bayline drill appeared in broken fragments, orange cones along wet grass, a gray levee slope, a pump station with faded numbers on the door, Keel, in a younger, healthier body, moving beside Jonah Reed. The image glitched twice. Then came the moment they had replayed too many times already. Keel sat near a patch of soft ground. Jonah's voice, broken by wind and digital damage, came through. "Mark this section. He's catching something here." Static. Then, "Not just the dog. Look at the seep line. Water's going the wrong way." The screen froze on Keel's alert posture. The room stayed quiet. Sawyer looked from the video to the notebook, the same area. The same warning, seen by different people before the storm had ever arrived, like a judge in gray robes. Nadine crossed her arms. "It's enough to bother me, not enough to stand up in front of anyone with a suit." "Then we get someone suits dislike," Marlene said. Sawyer looked at her. Marlene took her radio off her shoulder and tapped the antenna with the red ribbon. Lenora Batiste. Earl blinked. Nora still lives out near St. Amant? Lives there, frightens delivery drivers there, and knows more about levees than most men know about their own children. Nadine nodded slowly. She worked flood control for the parish. Retired, Marlene said, which means she can be rude for free. An hour later, they were standing in the converted garage of Lenora Nora Batiste, surrounded by rolled maps, old survey tubes, shelves of labeled binders, and the smell of rain-soaked paper. Nora Batiste was smaller than Sawyer expected, almost delicate at first glance, with a narrow frame, a slight bend in her back, and silver-black hair pinned low at the nape of her neck. Then she looked up from her desk, and any impression of softness ended. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and patient in the way of birds that hunted from high places. She did not invite them to sit. She did not coo over Keel. She took the notebook, the printed record, the photographs, and the video file, then pointed at a corner mat. Keel went there without being told twice, though his eyes stayed on Sawyer. Nora watched that. Then she watched Sawyer. "You are the man who pulled the dog from Cypress Row water," she said. Sawyer said, "Yes, ma'am." "And now you think the dog is evidence?" "No," Sawyer said after a pause. "I think he's alive. That made the evidence harder to ignore." Nora held his gaze 1 second longer than comfort allowed. "Better answer," she said. For the next 40 minutes she spoke very little. She played the Bayline video 6 times. She compared Earl's notes to an old levee map. She placed a clear ruler over printed photographs. She marked angles in red pencil. She enlarged one blurry frame until it became mostly gray squares and still managed to find meaning in it. Marlene grew restless after 15 minutes and was told, without Nora looking up, "If you sigh again, Tate, I will assign you drainage math." Marlene whispered to Sawyer, "She always threatens the innocent first." Nora finally stopped the video on the frozen image of Keel sitting near the levee base. She tapped the screen 3 times with the end of her pencil. "There." Sawyer leaned closer. Nora slid Earl's notebook beside the laptop. "The dog alerted near marker 14B. Mr. Pritchard's pressure notes show abnormal readings in the same area. Your photographs show post-storm exposure here and here." She circled 2 sections with the pencil. "This failure did not begin when Marrow Bend arrived." Earl's face tightened. Nadine asked, "How sure are you?" Nora removed her glasses. "Hurricanes reveal many sins. They do not invent all of them." The room fell still. Then Nora said it plainly, with no triumph in her voice. "A storm did not create this kind of wrong. A storm made it visible." For Sawyer, the words landed harder than accusation. Wrong, not damage, not bad luck, not an act of God wearing rain. Wrong. Nora continued, "I cannot prove fraud from this. Do not let anyone say I claimed that. What I can say is that the visible signs are consistent with substandard work or incomplete remediation before the storm. Thin reinforcement layer, shallow anchoring possibly, mismatched fill, seepage in a section listed as treated. That is enough to demand independent inspection." "Demand from who?" Sawyer asked. Nora's mouth curved without humor. "The people who will hope you go away." Keel rose from the mat and walked to Sawyer, placing himself close, but not touching. The old warehouse had made him tremble. Nora's garage made him watchful. There was a difference, and Sawyer was beginning to learn the grammar of it. Marlene folded her arms. "We need the public to know enough that nobody can bury the request." Nora looked displeased by the word public, as if it were a room that smelled of wet carpet. "Then you need a reporter who can count past 2. "I know one," Marlene said. "Unfortunately, she knows it." Quinn Delacroix arrived at Sawyer's house that evening wearing rubber boots, a navy rain jacket, and the expression of someone prepared to disbelieve everyone equally. She was in her late 30s with dark hair tied low, tired brown eyes, and a small waterproof camera bag slung across her chest. She did not look like a polished television face. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 2 days wading through storm water, listening to people explain ruin in 3 different versions before breakfast. Marlene had called her. Quinn had answered, "If this is about Bigfoot in the pump station, I'm hanging up." Now she stood at Sawyer's kitchen table, flipping through copies of Earl's notes and Keel's microchip record. "So," Quinn said, "you have a dog marked dead, a closed rescue outfit, a damaged video, an old pressure log, and an unofficial engineering opinion." Nadine bristled. Nora Batiste does not have unofficial opinions. She has conclusions other people are too slow to deserve. Quinn held up one hand. "I'm not dismissing it. I'm telling you what a station lawyer will say." Sawyer appreciated that. He did not trust easy belief. It usually arrived wearing the same shoes as easy betrayal. Quinn turned to him. "Why bring this to me?" "Because if we hand it straight to the wrong office," Sawyer said, "it disappears." "Do you have reason to believe that?" Marlene snorted. "Honey, we live in Louisiana." Quinn ignored her, eyes still on Sawyer. He pointed to Keel. "Someone marked him dead without proof. Someone closed Bayline's file. Someone ignored Earl's readings. Someone said the levee section was fixed. Now, half of Cypress Row is underwater." Keel stood beside him, thin and silent. Quinn's gaze lingered on the dog longer than she probably intended, not sentimentally, carefully. "What's his name?" she asked. "Keel." She read the record again. Harbor's Keel. At the full name, Keel's ears shifted. The whole room noticed. Quinn's face changed. Not much, but enough. She lowered the paper. "All right, I'll look." "Look where?" Nadine asked. "Contracts, emergency management vendors, Calder and Rusk, Cypress Row, Bayline, and whoever pushed the quarantine transfer request on the dog." Sawyer already knew the answer to the last part. Reese Calloway did not wait long to remind him. The first notice arrived the next morning, a printed request taped to Sawyer's front door in a plastic sleeve. It stated that the recovered animal, lacking verified vaccination and ownership documentation, must be transferred to the parish quarantine point within 24 hours unless medical exemption papers were filed. Nadine filled out the exemption so aggressively the pen tore the paper. The second inconvenience came that afternoon. 2 men in municipal vests arrived to inspect Sawyer's house for storm safety compliance. They were polite, uncomfortable, and clearly sent by someone else. One of them apologized under his breath while checking Sawyer's porch supports. The third came by rumor. Marlon Bix told Marlene, and Marlene told Sawyer, that Reese had been speaking to Cypress Row residents in the community hall. Nothing direct, nothing actionable. Just soft words dropped like sandbags. Sawyer Voss was under strain. Sawyer Voss had combat issues. Sawyer Voss meant well, but people in crisis sometimes saw patterns that were not there. The dog was a health risk. The rumors found Sawyer before sunset. He stood on his porch listening, one hand hanging by his side, not quite touching the bracelet. Keel lay inside near the door, but at the sound of Reese's name from Marlene's mouth, the shepherd lifted his head. The dog had never been introduced to politics. Still, he understood tone. Animals often understood kingdoms better than kings did. Quinn called just after dark. "I found Pelican Ward Services," she said without greeting. Sawyer put the phone on speaker. Nadine, Marlene, and Earl were all in the kitchen again. Keel slept near the threshold, though his ears moved with every voice. "Emergency Compliance Consulting," Quinn continued. "Small firm, bare website. They received payment from Calder and Rusk Infrastructure last year, and again this spring." Marlene leaned forward. "And?" "Reese Calloway did contract work for Pelican Ward. Not listed as Calder and Rusk, technically separate." Technically, Nadine said, is where cowards go swimming. Quinn added, There's more. Reese's ex-wife is Damon Rusk's sister. Earl looked confused. Damon Rusk, as in Calder and Rusk? Yes. The kitchen went quiet except for the rain tapping the window. Quinn said, It doesn't prove he caused anything. It proves he should not be managing residents, quarantine transfers, or access around a failure site connected to that company without disclosing the relationship. A conflict of interest, Nadine said. A well-dressed one, Marlene muttered. Sawyer looked toward Keel. The dog was awake now, eyes open, head still down. His body had gone tight at the soft rustle of Sawyer's rain jacket hanging by the door. Not thunder this time, not metal, just the sound of slick fabric moving. Sawyer remembered the way Keel had frozen at the crate, the way he had backed from the dented cabinet, the way his old leash had come from a place that smelled of abandonment. Some fears did not need words to explain themselves. They lived in muscle, waiting for familiar sounds to open them. After the call ended, the house seemed smaller. Nadine gathered her papers. Earl closed his notebook. Marlene checked her radio and cursed softly at static. Outside, Marrow Bend sat under a bruised sky, still wet, still waiting. Sawyer's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He looked at it for a moment before opening the message. The dog died once on paper. You can disappear in a rescue report, too. No signature, no flourish. Just a sentence built like a locked door. Marlene read it over his shoulder and went very still. Nadine's face hardened. Earl lowered his eyes as if the words had confirmed something he wished had stayed imaginary. Sawyer did not reply. He set the phone face down on the table. Keel rose and came to him, slower than usual. The young shepherd stopped at Sawyer's left side and touched his muzzle to the paracord bracelet. Sawyer looked at the dog, a creature erased by a file, a man who had spent years making himself small enough for the world to forget. The message on the table did not feel like a threat made of thunder or fists. It felt worse. It felt administrative, quiet, plausible, the kind of harm that could wear a badge, carry a clipboard, misplace a record, and call the absence procedure. Sawyer rested his hand on Keel's head. Outside, the rain kept falling on levees, rooftops, mailboxes, and all the papers people trusted until the water proved them thin. They like reports, Sawyer said quietly. Marlene watched him. What are you thinking? Sawyer kept his eyes on Keel. Then we make sure this one has witnesses. Rain returned before dawn, not with the fury of Marabelle's first arrival, but with the persistence of a creditor. It tapped on roofs, ran down porch posts, slipped under doors, gathered in ditches, and whispered through every low place in Marrow Bend. The town had begun to hope the water was leaving. By sunrise, the Gulf answered with a slow tidal push that turned hope around and sent it back up the streets. Roads became gray canals again. Porch steps disappeared. Plastic chairs floated from one yard to another like confused pilgrims. At the community hall beside the Baptist church, the generator coughed and stuttered under the weight of too many extension cords. People had slept in folding chairs, on gym mats, against walls, beside boxes of donated canned food. No children filled the room, only adults worn thin by floodwater and waiting. Elderly couples, shrimp boat hands, clerks, mechanics, a nurse from the urgent care clinic, 2 motel workers, a gas station owner, and half the displaced residents of Cypress Row. The air inside tasted of instant coffee, damp socks, and patience going bad. Sawyer Voss stood near the side wall with Keel beside him. The young German shepherd looked better than he had 2 days ago, but only in the way a half-repaired boat looked better because it had stopped sinking. His coat had dried into rough black and gold waves. The pale hook-shaped mark on his chest showed more clearly now. Nadine Mercer had wrapped one of his forelegs where a scrape had opened again, and Keel had accepted the bandage with grave irritation, as if medical care were a personal insult he would tolerate for the sake of diplomacy. He stayed close to Sawyer, but not hidden. That mattered. Sawyer had noticed the difference since the night at Bayline's warehouse. Keel was still afraid of tight spaces, slick raincoats, and metal doors that shut too hard. But in open rooms, near people, he watched, he calculated, he placed his body where it might matter. At the far end of the hall, Reese Calloway stood before a cluster of Cypress Row residents, one hand resting on his black waterproof clipboard. His navy rain jacket was clean again. Sawyer had begun to think Reese owned several identical jackets, each one born without mud, sin, or memory. "We are relocating the remaining Cypress Row residents to the South Warehouse shelter," Reese said, voice smooth enough to slide beneath a locked door. "The church annex is over capacity, and the south site has been cleared for temporary occupancy." Nora Baptiste, standing beside Earl Pritchard near the coffee table, went very still. Sawyer saw it before she spoke. The South Warehouse shelter sat near the old seafood packing buildings, lower than Baptist Hill, closer to the auxiliary pump road, and too near the stretch of levee Nora had marked in red pencil the night before. Marlene Tate muttered, "Cleared by who? A blind crawfish with a stamp?" Nadine, who had been checking Keel's bandage, did not look up. "Do not insult crawfish." Sawyer moved before he had fully decided to. He crossed the hall with Keel at his side. Conversations lowered as he approached. Some people watched him with gratitude. They had heard he pulled a dog from floodwater. Others watched with caution. They had heard other things too. That was how rumor worked in a small town. It did not choose one shape. It wore whatever face the listener already feared. "Reese," Sawyer said. Reese turned, smile already prepared. "Mr. Voss, that shelter is too low." A few residents glanced at one another. Reese lowered his voice, though not enough to keep the room from listening. "The site has been approved for temporary use." "By your people?" "By emergency coordination." "Nora Baptiste says the North Levee section near that access road is unstable." Reese's eyes flicked briefly toward Nora, then back. "Mrs. Baptiste is retired." Nora stepped forward. She was small, bent slightly at the back, raincoat hanging from her narrow shoulders like a gray banner. But her eyes could have stopped traffic. "Water does not observe retirement," she said. A few people murmured. Reese gave her a polite nod. "No one is ignoring your concerns, but we cannot run a shelter system on speculation." Earl clutched his blue waterproof notebook to his chest. "It ain't speculation if the pressure line says the same thing." Reese did not look at Earl long. Men like Reese were skilled at not looking where evidence had dirt under its nails. Before Sawyer could speak again, a deputy entered through the front doors, shaking rain from his hat. Deputy Calvin Rue was 42, broad enough to look steady without seeming oversized, with close-cut dark hair and a tan parish uniform under a brown rain jacket. A radio sat high on his shoulder. His face was square, tired, and careful. Sawyer knew him, not well, but enough. Calvin had been there the previous year when fireworks after a Saints win had gone off near the South Docks. Sawyer had lost almost a minute that night, not a dramatic minute to the people who later told it. He had not hurt anyone. He had not shouted. He had simply dropped behind his truck, hands over his head, breathing like the sky had collapsed. In Marrow Bend, a minute could become a reputation. Calvin looked at Sawyer now with the unease of a man trying to be fair to someone he did not fully trust. "Voss," he said, "can we step aside?" Sawyer knew what that tone meant. Still, he stepped aside. Keel followed. Calvin glanced down at the dog, then at the bandage, then at Sawyer. "I heard you're raising concern about the South Warehouse shelter." I'm saying it's too close to the weak section. You have an official inspection? Nora does. Nora has an opinion. Nora has 40 years of knowing when a levee is lying. Calvin sighed and touched the radio on his shoulder, not pressing it, just resting 2 fingers there as if authority might steady him. Sawyer, I respect her. I do. But I can't order a move on a retired engineer's word, a damaged video, a pressure log, and a dog with a strange file. Keel's ears shifted at the word dog. Sawyer kept his voice low. That strange file says he was dead while standing alive in front of us. I know. Then you know records can be wrong. Calvin's jaw tightened. I also know panic can spread faster than floodwater. These people have lost homes. They need direction, not 5 different warnings. Sawyer looked past him toward the Cypress Row residence. A woman in a motel sweatshirt held a grocery bag full of prescription bottles. An elderly fisherman sat with his hands folded over a cane. 2 refinery workers whispered near the coffee table. They were tired. They did need direction. That was what made Reese dangerous. He sounded like direction. I'm not trying to make things worse, Sawyer said. Calvin's expression softened for half a second. Then don't. The words landed quietly. They were not cruel. That made them harder. Across the hall, Reese raised his voice just enough. All movement decisions must go through official channels. We cannot have individuals, however well-intentioned, frightening residents with unverified claims. Sawyer turned. Reese did not look directly at him at first. He addressed the room, a calm man in a clean jacket offering order to wet, exhausted people. We understand this storm has been difficult, Reese continued. It can affect judgment. It can bring old fears to the surface. Not every sound in the night is an alarm. His eyes finally found Sawyer. Not every noise is war, Mr. Voss. The room seemed to inhale. The words did not shout. They slid. Sawyer felt them enter him like cold water under a door. Thunder rolled across the metal roof. For a moment, the hall bent at the edges. The generator became a convoy engine. The rain became sand against armor. Reese's soft voice dissolved into radio static. Sawyer's vision narrowed on nothing. His left hand closed around the paracord bracelet, hard enough to hurt. A name rose in his mind, then another. Men who had trusted his voice. Men who did not get to come home and be doubted in a church hall. His knees did not buckle. He did not cry out. To the room, perhaps, he only went still. But Keel saw more than the room did. The young shepherd rose on his hind legs and placed both front paws against Sawyer's thighs, pressing his narrow chest into him. Keel's body trembled with effort, but he held steady. His muzzle pushed against Sawyer's wrist, right where the bracelet cut into his palm. Weight, warmth, fur damp from the rain. Here, not sand, not smoke, not then. Here. Sawyer looked down into amber eyes that had survived their own erasure. He loosened his fingers. The hall returned piece by piece, Nadine's hand hovering but not touching him, Marlene's furious stare aimed at Reese, Nora watching not with pity but with calculation, Calvin looking ashamed and uncertain, residents whispering because people always whispered when pain became visible. Sawyer lowered one hand to Keel's head. "Get down," he whispered. Keel obeyed, but stayed pressed against his leg. Reese's expression had not changed much. Only his eyes betrayed satisfaction, small and polished. That was when Sawyer understood something useful. Reese did not need Sawyer arrested, removed, or shouted down. He only needed Sawyer doubted at the right moment. Sawyer said nothing more in the hall. He took Keel outside. Rain hit his face, clean and cold. Behind him, voices rose again. Instructions, questions, fear dressed as logistics. Nadine followed him to the porch. "You all right?" "No." She nodded once. "Better answer than usual." Marlene came next, radio hissing on her shoulder. I'd like 5 minutes alone with that man and a clipboard. I won't do anything illegal. I'll just explain gravity." "Nobody's listening," Sawyer said. Nora stepped into the rain last, holding her map tube under one arm. "Then stop asking them to believe you." Sawyer turned to her. "Make them believe the ground," Nora said. That evening, as the light thinned behind a curtain of rain, Keel became restless. At first Sawyer thought it was the hall, the voices, the smell of wet clothing and fear. Then Keel pulled toward the north access road. Not wildly, purposefully. He stopped at the end of his leash, looked back at Sawyer, then pulled again. Sawyer crouched. "What is it?" Keel's nose worked the air. His ears tilted forward, then sideways. He lowered his head toward the street where rainwater moved in narrow streams over the cracked pavement. Marlene, standing nearby, squinted into the gray. He asking for a walk or staging a coup? Keel pulled again. Sawyer looked north, toward the willows, toward the auxiliary pump road, toward marker 14B. His stomach tightened. "He knows that route," Sawyer said. Nora's eyes sharpened. "The training route?" "Maybe." Nadine appeared behind them with a flashlight and the expression of a woman who had already decided no one present was sensible enough to survive unsupervised. "If you're going, take antiseptic, dry gauze, and the understanding that I disapprove." Marlene lifted her radio. "That's practically a blessing." Sawyer called Earl, then Quinn, then Calvin. Calvin answered on the fourth ring. "This better not be another argument," the deputy said. Sawyer watched Keel standing in the rain, body angled north, every line of him fixed on something beyond human hearing. "You don't need to believe me," Sawyer said. "Believe the engineer. Meet us at the auxiliary pump road." Calvin was silent. Sawyer added, "If Nora says I'm wrong, I'll shut up." Another silence. Then Calvin said, 10 minutes. It took them 12 to reach the access road. Rain had turned the ground into slick black mud. Willow branches hung low over the water, their leaves shivering in the wind. The old seafood warehouses stood farther south, dark blocks against the gray, exactly where Reese wanted people moved. Keel led them along the higher edge of the road, nose low, paws careful. He did not act like a dog chasing a scent trail in a yard. He moved with learned focus, stopping at breaks in the ground, avoiding a submerged dip before Sawyer saw it, pausing near a concrete culvert where water made a thin, high sound. Nora heard it too. She knelt in the mud without hesitation, her gray raincoat spreading around her like a small storm cloud. Sawyer held the flashlight. Earl, breathing hard from the walk, opened his notebook with trembling hands. Water seeped from the levee base in a narrow, pulsing line. Not a sheet of runoff. A pulse? Nora's face drained of color. "Light here," she ordered. Sawyer shifted the beam. She pressed gloved fingers into the mud near the seep, then pulled them back. The soil slumped too easily. A small thread of water widened under the beam. Marlene whispered, "That bad?" Nora did not make jokes. That was answer enough. "This section is losing integrity," she said. "Faster than it should. Much faster." Earl turned his notebook toward her. "That's the same line, same pressure rise." Quinn arrived then, hood up, camera bag against her chest. She did not begin filming at once. She looked at Nora first. "May I record?" Nora's eyes stayed on the water. "You had better." The camera came on. A pair of headlights swept through the rain. Deputy Calvin Roos stepped out of his vehicle, boots sinking into mud, one hand already at his shoulder radio. "What am I looking at?" he asked. Nora stood, mud streaking her knees. She spoke in a voice so steady it made the rain seem nervous. "A developing failure at the levee base. If that shelter fills before people are moved, the south road could be cut off." Calvin looked at Sawyer. Sawyer said, Don't believe me. Believe her. Earl lifted the notebook. And the readings. Quinn angled the camera toward the seep. Keel stood near the same point shown in the bayline video, his body rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed on the water, as if the old lesson had returned in the worst possible classroom. Calvin looked from Nora to Earl, from Earl to Keel, from Keel to the widening line in the mud. The deputy's face changed, not dramatically, not with music, just a man moving from doubt to responsibility and feeling the weight arrive. A low tearing sound came from the levee. Everyone froze. A section of earth near the base slumped downward. Mud slid into the water with a heavy, wet sigh. Then a stronger stream burst through, brown and forceful, like a wounded animal finding breath. Marlene grabbed her radio. "Volunteer net, this is Tate. I need high water trucks and flatboats ready near the south warehouse route. Possible shelter relocation. Stand by." Quinn kept filming, rain running down her camera housing. Then Reese Calloway appeared from the access road, carrying a flashlight and that same black clipboard as if it could command the flood. "What are you doing here?" he called. "This is a restricted area." Nora did not turn around. Water failed to respect the restriction. Reese's mouth tightened. He spotted Quinn's camera. "Stop recording. You're interfering with emergency operations." "No," Quinn said calmly. "I'm documenting them. You all need to leave this area immediately." Calvin stepped between Reese and the group. For the first time since Sawyer had known him, the deputy did not look toward procedure for shelter. He became it. "Mr. Calloway," Calvin said, "step back." Reese stared at him. "Deputy, I am the designated resident safety coordinator for Cypress Row. And I'm opening a localized evacuation order." Reese's smile vanished so quickly it was like a light going out. Calvin touched his radio. His eyes met Sawyer's through the rain. "Voss," he said, voice firm now, "you know the high route behind those warehouses?" Sawyer felt something in his chest strike once, like a match in wet wind. "Yes." "Show us." The rain fell harder. The levee whispered behind them. Keel pressed against Sawyer's leg, not trembling now, but ready. Sawyer looked at the dog, then at Calvin, then toward the dim line of warehouses where people waited without knowing the water had begun choosing for them. For once, the fire inside him was not the old fire. Not the one made of noise, loss, and desert. This was smaller, cleaner. A lantern cupped in both hands. He nodded. "Follow Keel," Sawyer said. Rain came down so hard it made the world look unfinished. The old seafood warehouses rose ahead of them like dark ships run aground, their metal roofs shining under the sweep of flashlights. Beyond them, the south shelter waited in the low ground, filled with people who had been told they were safer there because a man with a clean jacket and a clipboard had said so. Behind Sawyer, the levee whispered. Not loudly. That was the terrible part. It did not roar like a monster in a story. It hissed and pulsed and breathed through the mud, the way a secret might breathe when it realized the door had been opened. Deputy Calvin Rue spoke into his shoulder radio, voice tight but clear. "This is Rue, initiating localized evacuation from the South Warehouse shelter. Need high water trucks, flatboats, and volunteer support on the high route behind the seafood buildings. Repeat, localized evacuation. Not a drill." Static answered first, then Marlene Tate's radio crackled from her hand. "Volunteer net copies, Calvin. Trucks rolling from Baptist Hill. Flatboat team moving from Parish Road 9. And if anybody asks whether this is official, I'll say your name with confidence." Calvin gave her a look. Marlene shrugged. "That's what leadership sounds like, sweetheart." Sawyer stood beside Keel at the edge of the access road. The young German shepherd had gone very still, nose pointed toward the warehouses, rain running off his black and gold coat in narrow streams. His harness sat loose over his thin frame, borrowed and imperfect, but his posture had changed. He no longer looked like a rescued animal waiting for permission to exist. He looked like a dog remembering a job. Sawyer crouched and touched 2 fingers to Keel's shoulder. "You know this way?" Keel turned his head just enough for one amber eye to meet his. Then he stepped forward, not fast, not uncertain. Forward. Sawyer followed. The high route was not much of a route at all. It ran behind the old seafood packing buildings, along a raised strip of broken shell, gravel, and packed dirt that locals once used to move crates when the front road flooded. On the official Cypress Row resident maps, it appeared as a service margin, unnamed and useless. In the Bayline drill video, it had been a path marked with cones and footsteps, and one young K-9 trainee learning the scent of safe ground. Keel remembered it by things no map cared to keep: the sour sweetness of rotting wood near the loading dock, the iron smell of wet hinges, the salt mud under the crushed shells. The turn where Jonah Reed had once tapped his thigh and said, "Easy, Keel, high ground is a promise." The file had erased the dog, but the body had kept the route. Sawyer moved with Calvin on one side and Marlene behind him, her radio hissing like an angry insect. 2 volunteers followed with coil ropes and flashlights. Quinn Delacroix trailed farther back, camera sealed in a rain cover, filming only when she could do it without slowing the group. Nora Batiste stayed near the levee with Earl for a few more minutes, marking the seep line and calling out details for the record. Thunder rolled over the warehouses. Sawyer's vision flickered. For half a second, the line of metal buildings became a row of desert walls. Rain became grit. Flashlights became muzzle flashes in the dark part of memory where time had no mercy. His steps slowed. Keel stopped too. The dog looked back, rain dripping from his muzzle. He did not bark. He did not pull hard. He simply waited, with the leash stretched between them like a thin bridge over an old abyss. Sawyer swallowed. Here, Louisiana, rain, dog, men and women waiting. Here. Keel gave one small tug. Sawyer moved again. They reached the first turn behind the warehouses just as a gust drove rain sideways under the loading bay roof. Keel veered left before the human eye saw why. A section of gravel had washed out, leaving a narrow trench under the water. One volunteer stepped too close and slipped to one knee. Calvin grabbed his shoulder before he went down fully. "Watch the left," Sawyer called. "Keel's marking the edge." Marlene repeated it into the radio. "High route team says stay right at the first loading bay. Washed out trench on the left. Follow the dog's line." A voice came back through static. "Did you say follow the dog?" Marlene glanced at Keel, who was already moving again, with more sense than most committees. "Yes, Dennis. The dog is promoted." They pressed on. The south warehouse shelter came into view through rain and darkness. It was a long, low building with 2 roll-up doors and a narrow porch roof where water poured down in sheets. Several vehicles sat outside, some already half surrounded by rising water. People crowded in the open doorway, confused by the sudden arrival of flashlights, radios, and a deputy calling for movement. Calvin raised both hands. "Listen up. We are moving everyone to higher ground. Bring medicine, wallets, phones, keys if you have them. Leave furniture, boxes, and anything that slows you down." A man in a mechanic's jacket called back, "Reese said we were safer here." Calvin's jaw tightened. Reese is not in charge of the water. That sentence did more than an explanation could. It cut through the room. Sawyer moved to the doorway with Keel at his side. The shelter smelled of damp blankets, canned soup, old fish from the warehouse walls, and worry. People stared at the dog. Some recognized him now. The dead K-9 who was not dead. The flood dog. Sawyer's dog, though no paper yet, admitted it. Marlene began organizing people with the authority of a woman who had never asked a hurricane for permission. "You, sir, if that duffel weighs more than your left leg, Leave it. Ma'am, keep the medication bag. You two, help Mr. Landry to the truck. Somebody unplug that coffee pot before it becomes a religious event. A round-faced diner owner near the back lifted a covered stock pot with both arms. Marlene, this gumbo has been going since noon. She stared at him. Leonard, if you drown for soup, I am writing departed in broth on your marker. For one blessed second, people laughed. Not because anything was funny enough, because laughter in that room was a match struck in the belly of a cave. The movement began. Volunteers guided elderly residents toward the first high-water truck. 2 refinery workers carried a man with a bad hip in a folding chair. A nurse kept calling out names from a damp clipboard. A gas station owner tucked 3 phones into her raincoat and told everyone she was now Communications Command, though no one had voted. Sawyer stood at the threshold, directing people toward the high route. Keel remained beside him until each group passed, then stepped forward as if checking the line. When someone hesitated near the washed-out trench, Keel angled his body right, making the safer path visible even to tired eyes. A storm could make humans forget the ground. Keel did not. Thunder broke again, this time louder. Sawyer felt the memory strike lower in his body, not just in his head. His hands remembered weight. His ears remembered names. His chest remembered the old impossible bargain. If he had been faster, if he had turned sooner, if he had heard the warning under the noise. He stopped beneath the warehouse awning, rainwater pouring in front of him like a curtain. Keel had moved ahead with the first group. For one sudden, terrible moment, Sawyer could not see him. The leash was not in his hand. His breath shortened. Then, from the dark, Keel appeared again. He had turned around halfway up the path. The young shepherd stood in the rain, looking back at Sawyer with fierce, exhausted patience. Not abandoned, not gone. Waiting. Sawyer closed his eyes once. The dead did not return because a man suffered well enough, but the living could be missed if he stared too long at graves. He stepped forward. Keel gave a low, satisfied huff and turned back to the route. The last group was loading when Keel suddenly stopped near the old auxiliary pump spur. His body changed so quickly, Sawyer felt it before he understood it. The dog's head snapped toward the pump station, a squat concrete structure half hidden behind a leaning fence and 2 flooded service drums. Water lapped at its lower step. The side door rattled under pressure. Keel gave one short bark, then another. Not panic. Alert. Sawyer turned. What? Keel pulled toward the station. Calvin saw it. Voss, we need to keep moving. Keel barked again, sharper. Marlene's radio crackled. Earl's voice came through, broken and strained. Anybody near pump spur? This is Earl. Door's jammed. I'm inside the auxiliary station. Sawyer's stomach dropped. Marlene grabbed the radio. Earl Pritchard, if you went back for that notebook, I will haunt you while you're still alive. Static? Then Earl. Valve map 2. Nadine, arriving with a medical pack, shouted over the rain. Of course he went back for paperwork. Men will risk their necks for anything except regular checkups. Sawyer was already moving. The pump station door had warped under water pressure and debris. Earl was visible through a narrow upper window, pale face behind rain-streaked glass. He clutched his blue waterproof notebook to his chest and had a rolled valve map tucked under one arm. The lower latch is wedged, Earl called. Water's rising inside. Calvin reached into his vehicle and pulled out a pry bar. Sawyer took position beside him. Together they worked the edge of the door, boots braced against the slick concrete step. Keel stood just behind them, barking once whenever the door shifted, as if counting progress. On 3, Calvin said. Sawyer nodded. 1, 2, 3. The latch screamed. The door opened 6 inches, then slammed back against pressure, again. This time the gap widened. Water spilled out around their boots. Earl pushed from inside with what little strength he had left. Calvin wedged the bar. Sawyer got one shoulder against the door and drove forward. The door gave. Earl stumbled out into Sawyer's arms, coughing, soaked, and angry, in the way only frightened old men tried to disguise. "I had it," Earl muttered. "You had a building trying to become a bathtub," Marlene snapped, grabbing him by the sleeve. "Congratulations on your ambition." Keel pressed his nose briefly to Earl's hand. Earl looked down at him, then at the notebook in his own grip. "Good dog," he whispered. "Better sense than me." Quinn was filming from the edge of the road when the larger break began. It started with a sound like heavy cloth tearing. Then the levee section near the marked seep slumped farther. Water rushed over the old road, picking up mud, branches, loose plastic barriers, and one cypress row sign that spun once in the current before breaking free. Nora stood in Quinn's camera light, rain flattening her silver-black hair against her face. She pointed toward the exposed material as the flood cut through the failed section. "This is not consistent with a completed reinforcement layer," she said, voice firm despite the storm. "The anchoring is shallow. The fill is mismatched. That exposed barrier fabric is not where the report says it should be." Quinn kept the camera steady. "Are you saying the work was substandard?" "I am saying," Nora replied, "that what the water has exposed does not match the safety claims made before this storm. That requires immediate independent inspection." It was not a verdict. It was worse for the people who feared truth. It was clear. Reese Calloway appeared in the frame, hair finely wet out of place, rain running down his clean jacket. "This is irresponsible," he said. "You are broadcasting unverified information during an emergency." Quinn did not lower the camera. Calvin stepped between Reese and Nora. His voice was cold enough to cut through rain. "Tonight, you are not coordinating anything. Stand down." Reese stared at him, and for the first time, his softness failed him. Without the room, without the clipboard's power, without tired residents needing order, he looked smaller. Just a man in expensive rain gear standing beside a truth he could not keep dry. The final truck pulled away from the south shelter just before the old road flooded completely. Flatboats carried the last volunteers around the back channel. The people who had been sleeping in the low warehouse now stood on higher ground beneath the wide porch of the old packing office, soaked, shaken, and alive. Some cried quietly, some cursed. Some called relatives. Leonard, the diner owner, still had his gumbo pot, though Marlene had threatened to make him wear it as a helmet if he lifted it again. Water swept across the road where they had been standing 20 minutes earlier. The Cypress Row sign floated past, face up now, its painted promise of safe coastal living smeared with mud. It turned once in the current and vanished into the dark. Keel collapsed on the high porch near Sawyer's boots. Not dramatically. His body simply decided it had given enough for one night. His front legs folded, his chest lowered, and he lay there in a shivering heap of wet fur, mud, and stubborn life. His eyes stayed open, fixed on Sawyer, as if even exhaustion could not make him surrender the habit of keeping watch. Sawyer knelt beside him. The rain softened for a moment, or perhaps his ears had simply grown tired of it. He placed one hand on Keel's back and felt the thin ribs rise and fall. The dog smelled of floodwater, wet grass, old fear, and something clean beneath it all. Breath, life, presence. Around them, people moved in the aftermath of being spared. Calvin spoke into his radio. Nora handed Quinn a folded note with marker numbers. Nadine checked Earl's pulse and scolded him in a voice that meant she was relieved. Marlene coordinated trucks while threatening 3 grown men into carrying water cases. Sawyer watched it all through rain-blurred eyes. For years, survival had felt like a debt. He had carried it like a stone under his ribs. Why him? Why not the 2 men whose names still rose with thunder? Why come home with hands strong enough to fix machines but not time? He had thought living meant owing the dead an answer he would never find. But tonight, on a warehouse porch above a road that had become water, a different thought came quietly. Survival did not have to be repayment. Sometimes it was equipment, a rope still coiled, a boat not yet sunk. A hand on the back of a dog the world had tried to erase. He had not saved the men he lost by saving these people. Grief was not a scale that could be balanced with strangers. But he had been here. He had moved when movement mattered. He had followed a young dog through rain and mud because the living had called. Keel exhaled and closed his eyes at last. Sawyer bent closer, shielding him from the rain with his body. "Good route," he whispered. "Good boy." The dog's tail moved once against the wet porch boards. Small, almost nothing. Enough. Behind them, the levee continued to break, and the cameras continued to record, and voices on radios carried the news toward offices that would not be able to pretend morning had arrived clean. But for one breath, Sawyer stayed still beside Keel. Not on a battlefield, not in a memory. Here, where the rain fell on the living, and the living answered back. After the rain, Marrow Bend looked like a ship that had crossed a cruel sea and somehow remembered its name. The town did not wake clean. Mud lay thick on porch steps. Shrimp baskets hung from fences where floodwater had left them like strange offerings. A white plastic chair sat high in the branches of a live oak, tilted as if an invisible guest had climbed there to watch the storm pass. Roof shingles glittered in ditches. Mailboxes leaned. The smell of salt, wet wood, diesel, and river silt moved through every street. But smoke began to rise from chimneys and cook stoves. That was how Marrow Bend announced it had survived, not with speeches, not with flags. With coffee boiling in dented pots, with neighbors dragging ruined furniture to the curb, with men in rubber boots arguing about whether a generator could be saved, with women sorting medicine bottles on kitchen tables, with someone laughing because Marlene Tate had threatened to confiscate Leonard's gumbo pot for the safety of the Republic. The people from the South Warehouse shelter had made it to higher ground, tired, soaked, shaken, alive. Sawyer Voss stood on the dock behind his house 2 mornings after the evacuation, looking out over the bayou as it carried storm debris toward the marsh. His old aluminum boat was tied to a post, scratched deeper than before. His boots were still wet, his shoulders ached from work and cold, and a night that had demanded more than any one man should have carried. Keel lay on the dock beside him. The young German shepherd had been wrapped in a dry blanket Nadine insisted was temporary medical equipment, though Sawyer suspected it had once belonged to her guest room. Keel's black and gold fur had finally been washed clean enough to show the pale hook-shaped mark on his chest. His ribs still showed. His left ear still sat lower when he was tired. But his eyes followed the world with a steadiness that had not been there the day Sawyer pulled him from the flood. A pelican landed badly on a piling across the water. Keel lifted his head. The bird looked offended by gravity. Sawyer watched it flap, stumble, recover, and pretend the whole thing had been intentional. "Same," he murmured. Keel exhaled through his nose. If it was not laughter, Sawyer accepted it as close enough. By noon, Quinn Delacroix's footage had traveled farther than anyone expected. It did not make Calder and Rusk infrastructure collapse overnight. The world rarely rewarded truth with that kind of clean theater. No one was dragged from an office in disgrace before sunset. No judge thundered from the clouds. No villain confessed because a camera had caught his hair out of place. What happened was slower, heavier, more useful. The parish emergency office issued a formal request for independent inspection of the North Levee section. The State Infrastructure and Flood Authority opened a preliminary review. Calder and Rusk's active repair contracts in the area were temporarily suspended pending assessment. Damon Rusk was called in for questioning by officials who used calm voices and took careful notes. Reese Calloway was removed from his role as Cypress Row's resident safety coordinator. That part reached Marrow Bend through 3 channels: Quinn's station, Calvin Rue's office, and Marlene Tate, who claimed her version was fastest because the truth travels quicker when it has good boots. Reese was not gone from the world. Men like him seldom vanished dramatically. He was placed under review for obstructing an emergency warning, failing to disclose a conflict of interest, and receiving consulting money through Pelican Ward Services, which had been paid by Calder and Rusk. There would be hearings. There would be lawyers. There would be phrases designed to blur guilt until it looked like fog. But the story was no longer buried. That mattered. The truth did not fall from the sky like lightning. It came up from the mud in pieces. Earl Pritchard's pressure logs, Nora Batiste's technical report, Quinn's footage, Nadine's veterinary records, the damaged Bayline video, Calvin's evacuation order, the witness statements of people who had stood in water and heard the levee breathe wrong. And Keel, a dog declared dead by a file, standing alive in front of everyone who had trusted the file. Sawyer had once thought justice should feel like impact. Loud. Final. A door kicked open, a shouted command, a clean line between before and after. Now he watched Earl sign an affidavit with shaking hands at Nadine's clinic, and he understood that sometimes justice was a table, a pen, a woman reading the same sentence twice to make sure no one could twist it later. Sometimes justice wore reading glasses. Sometimes it had mud under its fingernails. Sometimes it was an old engineer tapping a map with a red pencil and saying, "No, write that number correctly." Sometimes the heavens did not strike the guilty. Sometimes they merely made them sit under fluorescent lights while every soft sentence was recorded. For Sawyer, that was enough. Almost. Bayline Response and Recovery reopened in the record before it reopened anywhere else. Quinn found Jonah Reed through an old training contact in Texas. He agreed to speak by video call from a small apartment kitchen in another state, where the walls were bare and the light was too white. He looked younger than Sawyer expected, but worn in a way that made age difficult to count. Thin face. Short brown hair, eyes that had not slept well in months. Nadine set the laptop on her clinic counter. Sawyer stood beside it with Keel at his leg. Marlene hovered near the door, pretending she had not come early. Earl sat in a chair, cap in his hands. Nora stood with her arms folded, as if video calls were a personal insult. Quinn had permission to record only audio for her notes, not the screen. Jonah appeared, and for a moment he did not speak. His gaze locked on Keel. The dog looked at the laptop. His ears shifted. His body went still, not with terror this time, but with recognition traveling through fog. Jonah lifted one hand to his mouth. "Keel," he said. The dog stepped forward once. Sawyer felt the leash tighten. Jonah laughed, but it broke halfway and became something quieter. "Hey, harbor boy." Keel tilted his head. Then Jonah did something small. He lifted a black training whistle from around his neck, not to blow it loudly, only to show it. Keel's tail moved once. Not wildly, not the greeting of a dog whose heart had never been hurt. Just once. A door opening a crack. Jonah looked away from the camera. His shoulders shook once, and he pressed his fingers against his eyes. "I thought they had taken him too far," he said. "I thought I was too late." Nadine's voice softened. "Tell us what happened." Jonah told them what he could. Bayline had run a preseason evacuation drill near the North Levee. Keel had alerted at soft ground by the pump station. Jonah had noticed seepage that did not match the official repair claims. He reported it internally. Within days, Bayline's contracts began disappearing. Insurance problems appeared. Lease trouble followed. A consultant questioned their training practices. Then Keel was taken during what Jonah was told would be a veterinary transfer review. After that, a report claimed Keel had died in a training accident caused by handler error. Jonah had fought it. He had been threatened with legal action. He had been told that speaking publicly would damage the remaining handlers, the dogs, and any chance of future disaster work. He had left the state with a stain on his name and a silence in his chest where Keel used to be. "I signed nothing about the dog being dead," Jonah said. "I never saw a body, never saw a vet report, never saw proof." His voice shook again when Keel rested his chin on Sawyer's boot. "He always did that," Jonah whispered. "Picked one person and anchored them." Sawyer looked down. Keel's amber eyes lifted to him. For one breath, Sawyer felt the strange ache of being chosen by something that had already lost too much. Jonah cleared his throat. "Mr. Voss?" "Sawyer," he said. "Is he safe with you?" The room went very quiet. Sawyer did not answer quickly. A younger man might have said yes with pride. An easier man might have said it like ownership. Sawyer looked at Keel's thin shoulders, the scar at his ear, the foreleg bandage, the eyes that still checked doors before resting. Then he said, "I'm learning how to make sure of that." Jonah nodded. It seemed to be the answer he trusted most. The paperwork took longer than the rescue. That was something Marlene said 3 times and Nadine said 5, each time with less humor and more paperwork in her hands. The microchip registry required correction requests, veterinary verification, ownership review, handler statement, and state disaster exception notes. Nadine filled out forms. Jonah sent a sworn statement. Quinn provided documentation of the false status as part of her ongoing reporting. Calvin wrote an incident summary confirming Keel's role in the evacuation route, though he spent 15 minutes arguing with himself over how to phrase, "The dog led us." Finally, one gray afternoon, Nadine called Sawyer back to the clinic. The lobby smelled of antiseptic, damp fur, and coffee strong enough to restart a stalled truck. Keel stood beside Sawyer, wearing the repaired leather collar Earl had brought that morning. It was dark brown, old but polished, with a small metal plate riveted to the front. Keel, alive. Earl had claimed the engraving was temporary until someone with prettier tools fixed it. Nobody believed him. Nadine turned her laptop around. The screen showed the corrected record. Harbor's Keel status, alive transferred to lawful adoption. Sawyer read it once, then again. The words were simple, too simple for what they carried. Keel could not read them, of course, but perhaps he felt the room change. Perhaps he understood the way Nadine's shoulders dropped, the way Marlene went suspiciously quiet, the way Earl looked at his own hands as if they had done something worthwhile after all. Sawyer crouched and touched the plate on Keel's collar. "Alive," he said. Keel licked his chin. Marlene sniffed. "That dog has poor taste." Nadine handed Sawyer the adoption papers before anyone could notice her eyes were bright. "Sign here before I start charging you boarding fees." Sawyer signed. His hand shook a little. Not from thunder, from the weight of choosing to belong to something again. There was no grand ceremony, just a small gathering at the old pump dock the following Sunday, when the rain had thinned to mist and the town had begun the long work of becoming itself again. Marlene brought coffee in a metal thermos and declared it superior to Sawyer's machine lubricant. Nadine brought supplements for Keel and strict instructions disguised as conversation. Earl brought a folded valve map he said Sawyer should keep, in case the town tries to be stupid again. Nora brought no gift, only a corrected copy of her report, which she said was more useful than flowers and lasted longer. Calvin Rue stood a little apart in uniform, hat in hand, looking like a man who had rehearsed one sentence and distrusted every word in it. Finally, he approached Sawyer. Keel watched him, not tense, but attentive. Calvin looked from the dog to Sawyer. "I should have listened sooner." Sawyer studied him for a moment. The old part of him wanted to say nothing, to let the apology hang, to make Calvin feel the full weight of every second lost to doubt. But the newer part, the part that had followed a half-starved dog through rain because the living still needed roads, understood something else. A bridge did not have to be wide to matter. Sawyer nodded once. "You listened in time." Calvin swallowed. "Barely. Barely counts in a flood." Marlene, from behind them, said, "Put that on a parish slogan." Even Nora smiled, though she did it quickly, as if worried someone might report her. Keel did not become whole overnight. Neither did Sawyer. That was not how storms worked. Water could leave a street in a day and still live inside the walls for months. Keel still stiffened at the sound of a metal door closing too hard. He still refused crates. If a yellow raincoat moved too suddenly in the corner of his eye, his body would go rigid for a few seconds, and he would look toward Sawyer as if asking whether the old world had found him again. Sawyer learned those signs. He learned to leave doors open. He learned not to rush the leash. He learned that trust, like a levee, was not proven by standing in sunshine. It was proven when pressure came and the structure held. Keel, in turn, learned Sawyer's signs. The tightening of his left hand, the way his eyes lost focus when thunder walked too close. The silence that came before memory tried to open. Keel would rise then, cross the room, and set his muzzle on Sawyer's wrist, right over the paracord bracelet. Not every time, not perfectly. He was a young dog, not an angel carved from obedience. Sometimes he got distracted by a crab under the dock or by the deep injustice of Nadine's vitamin chews. But often enough, more often than Sawyer expected life to be kind. Weeks passed. Marrow Bend repaired itself in crooked lines. Roofs were patched. Mold was scrubbed. Trucks hauled away debris. The Cypress Row sign was never put back. Calder and Rusk remained under investigation, their names spoken carefully now, no longer with the smooth confidence of men who believed water could be fooled by paperwork. Quinn kept reporting, not with fire in her voice, but with patience. A small town, she said on air, deserved a large truth told carefully. Nora's report entered official review. Earl's notebook became evidence instead of a lonely habit. Jonah's statement reopened Bayline's closure record. Nadine pretended not to be proud of everyone, and failed. Sawyer went back to fixing pumps, but not exactly as before. Keel rode with him in the truck now, stretched across the passenger floorboard or sitting upright when the road smelled interesting. People waved. Some waved at Sawyer. Most waved at Keel. Sawyer found he did not mind being second in his own truck. At night, Keel slept inside the house, near Sawyer's bed, but not on it. He had tried the bed once, placed one paw on the mattress, thought deeply about law, gravity, and dignity, then returned to the floor with the air of a judge postponing a ruling. One evening, rain came softly over Marrow Bend. Not a storm, not a warning, just rain. It tapped the metal roof of Sawyer's house and slid down the windows in silver threads. The bayou outside smelled of mud, salt, and wet cedar. Far away, thunder murmured once over the gulf. Sawyer woke. His body tightened before his mind did. That still happened. Healing had not made him into a man untouched by sound. The old doors remained inside him. Some still opened before he could stop them. But this time, the memory did not take the whole room. He saw the ceiling. He heard rain. He felt the blanket over his legs. The thunder rolled again, farther away. Keel lifted his head from the floor. Sawyer lowered his hand. The dog rose, slow and sleepy, and came to the side of the bed. He placed his muzzle in Sawyer's palm with the solemn gentleness of a creature returning a borrowed soul. Sawyer let out a breath. "Just rain," he whispered. Keel blinked. Outside, Marrow Bend rested under clouds that no longer seemed hungry. The town still bore scars. So did the man. So did the dog. Some things did not vanish because a form had been corrected, or because a collar said alive, or because a night ended without disaster. But Keel was here. Sawyer was here. The rain was rain. And sometimes, in a world where records lied, levees failed, and soft voices tried to bury the living, presence was the truest miracle left. Keel settled beside the bed, breathing slow. Sawyer kept his hand resting on the dog's neck until sleep came for him again. This time, when thunder moved far out over the gulf, it did not call him back to war. It only passed through the dark and kept going. Sometimes healing does not arrive like thunder. It comes quietly, like rain softening on an old roof, like a loyal dog resting his head in your hand, like one more breath after a night you thought would never end. Sawyer and Keel remind us that being broken does not mean being finished. A record can lie, a storm can take much, and fear can follow us for years. But grace still finds ways to bring the living back home. Maybe today, someone watching this is carrying a storm no one else can see. May you remember this: you do not have to cross the flood alone. God can send help in the smallest, strangest, most faithful forms. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet miracles still matter, please subscribe and stay with us for the next journey. May peace find you gently, even after the rain.